Hi, I'm Brandon Smith, synthesis instructor at Beat Drop, and today I'm going to show you how to make a future pad sound using operator and instrument racks in Ableton Live. So the sound we're going to wind up with is something like this. So to show you that in the context of a track, it sounds something like this. Now mind you, this is with some added effects which we're going to get to later in the video. So future pad sounds are typically very lush and very layered. If you listen to them carefully, you can hear lots of stuff going on. So for these types of sounds, I almost always employ the instrument rack. I'm going to go to Categories, Instruments, grab the instrument rack, and drag it to my MIDI track. If you start making a sound using a single instrument and then find that you want to layer it after the fact, you can always click on it and hit Command-G, which will automatically group it into an instrument rack for you. So we've got our instrument rack set up. I'm going to start by putting an operator in my instrument rack. It's usually a good idea to label your different layers in your instrument rack so you know which ones you're turning on and off or turning the volume up and down on. So I'm going to call this top layer. So this is going to serve as kind of my foundation of the sound. The first thing I'm going to do is go to my master section in operator, which is found on the lower right-hand corner if you click on this section. And then I'm going to go to the top where all of the different algorithms are, and I'm going to click on the one on the far right. So this would be our parallel mode where we don't have FM happening. We don't have the operators or the oscillators in operator modulating each other. We're just hearing them independently of one another. Once I put it in parallel mode, I'm going to change the oscillator wave shapes that I have. So I'm going to set the first two to the wave shape saw D. So we've got saw D on oscillator A, saw D on oscillator B. I'm going to go up to C and change this one to a square D. And then I'm going to do likewise with oscillator D. So we've got two sawtooth waves and two square waves that are kind of the fundamental basis of our sound. The next thing I'm going to do is turn up the volumes on oscillators B, C, and D. Now this might be sort of loud initially when we try it. Woo, yeah, that was really loud. So I'm going to back way off on my volume on the track here. And I'm probably going to turn down the volume of my layer a little bit as well. What I'm going to do now is turn my coarse tuning down on one of the sawtooth waves and on one of the square waves. So I'm just going to pick oscillator A, turn that one's coarse tuning down to 0.5, which means it'll make it one octave lower than the other one. And I'm going to do that to one of the square wave ones as well. So I'm going to take this top one, oscillator D, and turn its tuning down to 0.5. And you can hear the sound got a little bit broader. The only other thing I'm really going to do to this layer is actually just turn up the polyphony. So if I click on my master section, you can see that down here where it says voices, we've got 6 voices. Because this is a future pad sound and we're typically playing very big, complex chords with it, 6 notes of polyphony isn't really going to cut it. So just to be on the safe side, I always like to turn it up to about 14 voices. So I'd say that's a pretty decent base coat or first layer of our sound. So now I want to add a layer that has a little bit more animation in it. This one I'm going to call my saw layer. So I'm going to grab another operator, drop it in the instrument rack, and I'm going to rename this one to saw layer. So whenever we're making sounds in instrument racks like this, it's a good idea to just hone in on individual devices within the rack, and then as a last step, try and sort of bring them all together. So I'm actually going to mute my top layer by clicking on the little speaker icon. So this is turning it off so that we don't hear it. So my first step is to do what I did with the first operator. I need to click on my master section and change the routing to the last mode, the parallel mode. So now that I've done that, I'm going to change all of these oscillator wave shapes to saw D. By the way, the reason I'm picking saw D for all of these and not the other saw waveforms is because it's a lot easier to filter out high order harmonics than it is to kind of sneak them back in. So if we use a really bright sound like that saw D, we ensure that we have plenty of material to work with, and when we feed it through filters and things, it's going to have a really nice effect. So we'll change that one to saw D, we'll change oscillator B to saw D, we'll change them all to saw D. And of course, you'll probably want to back off on the volume in this case as well, so it doesn't blow your ears off. We'll turn up the levels on all of them. Well, it's definitely a sawtooth sound, but it's a very dry and boring sort of sawtooth sound. So we want to liven this up and have some kind of natural motion in the sound. So the first thing I'm going to do is go through all of these oscillators and click on this little R button down here. So when the R is engaged, that means that the phase of the waveforms will re-trigger each time a new note is played. So in other words, the waveforms will start in the exact same spot every time. But on a lot of older analog synths, the sort of nice chorusing effect you get from the oscillators beating against each other and not quite being in tune is partially to do with the fact that their waveforms are also out of phase with each other. So you get this really nice chorusy kind of sound from that. So we can turn off the re-triggering just by clicking the R button. And this will make the oscillators what's known as free running, which means that they just run at the phase that they run at. So now that I've turned off the re-triggering, you can hear that it didn't make a huge difference in the sound, but the difference is definitely there. So I can probably turn up the volume a little bit more now. The next thing I'm going to do is detune all of these oscillators apart from each other, just a little bit. So generally, I don't go much beyond, say, 10 for fine tuning. Some people like these sounds more sour than others, so the amount of detuning is totally subjective. It's totally up to you. I generally try and make them all different numbers, or I've got oscillator A, I should say, set at 5. I've got oscillator B set at 3. I've got oscillator C. I'll I'll set this one to 8. And I'll set this top one to 10. So now let's listen to the sound after the oscillators have been slightly detuned from each other. Well, already it's got a much more lush and chorusy sound. And we can even do some other things like play with the phase of some of these waveforms. And you can see what happens when I move that phase. You can see the picture of the sawtooth wave moves a little bit. So if I want to, say, just move a couple of those, that also helps give it that nice lush chorus. And if I actually hold down a chord, you can hear a bit of this motion in the sound. Now we also have this handy spread control in Operator, which is basically a stereo detuning. So when we turn this up, it will detune the voices in the left and right sides a little bit differently. So what we wind up is a really nice, lush stereo sound. Now, I've noticed as I've been playing that the polyphony isn't quite right. It's not playing all the notes I want it to play. So I need to do what we did with the other operator and go to the master section and turn up my voice count to 14 voices. That's starting to sound really nice and lush now. The only other thing I would really do to this sound is a neat little operator trick. Well, and really it's an FM synthesis trick to add a little bit of sort of pseudo white noise. Now we could very easily change one of these oscillators to a noise waveform, say use the looped noise or the white noise. But I like using this trick better because you still are using it as an oscillator with a regular wave shape, but it just makes it sound more noisy. So what I'm going to do is click on oscillator A, and right over here where it says feedback, I'm going to start turning that up and see if you can hear what happens to the sound when I turn the feedback up. So I just turned up the volume a little bit so you could hear it more, but basically the sound of that sawtooth got a little distorted and started to turn into white noise, or something sort of approximate to white noise. So that feedback trick is basically feeding the oscillator back on itself and creating this really interesting kind of hissy, dirty sound. So if you're a fan of really dirty synth sounds, the feedback control in Operator is going to be something that you'll want to play around with. So now, if we turn on our other layer, our top layer, so we're almost there, but I feel like this sound could still use even another layer on top of it to really push it over the top and make it a huge sound. So I'm going to add a third operator to the mix. And I'm going to rename this one the low layer. So we'll turn our others off for a moment. Just like the name suggests, my low layer is just going to be similar to the saw layer, just transposed down by an octave, so it sort of fills in kind of the lower register of the sound. For my low layer, I'm going to employ my saw D again, Rather than manually changing my wave shapes for each oscillator, which I was doing before, a quicker way of doing that is just to click on the next oscillator, right click, and go copy from oscillator A. And you can see that it made it exactly the same volume, exactly the same wave shape, and everything. So definitely comes in handy when you're making lots of layered sounds like this. Just make sure that you click over on the right side here. There. So now we've got all the oscillators set to the exact same thing. But we're still in an FM mode, which is why it sounds like that. So we need to change it to our last mode, our parallel mode. That's quite loud, so I'm going to turn down the volume. Because this is my low layer, I want to change the coarse tunings to 0.5. I'll also turn up the spread control a little bit. I don't want to have it quite as chorusy as my regular saw layer, but I do want a little bit of that nice spread in there, so yeah, I think that's probably about right, like 30% or so. So now let's hear what this sounds like all together with all three layers engaged. That's a pretty huge sound. Once my operators are set up, once my instrument rack is all dialed in, my next step is to add some audio effects. So probably one of the most common types of effects to add to pad sounds, and especially these big future pad type sounds, is just chorus. So I'm going to go to audio effects and just grab the chorus plugin. So keep in mind that when you're putting audio effects on instrument racks, if I were to drag the chorus to here, it's only going to affect this operator, but not the other two. So I want to put it at the end of the instrument racks to make sure that it's affecting everything inside of it. So now we have the chorus. I've got the dry wet set to about 50%. So I'm just going to play around a little bit by just dragging this little green ball inside the XY pad to change the modulation rate and amount until I get a sound that I like. So now that we've got our chorus, this sound needs to be sort of glued together nicely so that all three elements sort of wind up sounding like part of the same sound. I'm going to pick one of my favorite presets from a device called a multiband compressor. So I'm going to go up to my search bar here and type in OTT. And you can see the multiband dynamics showed up with our OTT preset. Here's the sound without our multiband compression. And now here's with multiband compression. Well, you can hear that it does a really nice job of kind of scrunching everything together, but it also made the volume drop quite a bit because we've now got quite a reduction in the gain. So what we need to do is bump up the output level again so that we're sort of back to our normal volume. So if I just start turning up my output level here, I'll try and get it more or less where I was before we inserted the compressor. And if you want to see if you're close, just bypass it and A/B and see if you have a loud enough signal when the compressor's turned back on. So I'd say that's pretty close. So now I'm going to record the chords that I'm going to use with my future pad sound. So keep in mind that while the actual synthesis part of your future pad is important, what chords you play is also really important. And future jazz and this sort of future house genre of music contains a lot of really jazzy sounding chords. But they're actually a lot easier to make than you think. So everyone's familiar with the major and minor chords. So if you take like a C chord, for example, you've got major and minor. So what we do is we add things like sevenths to them. These are different notes that go on top of your chord. So all we do is count from the bottom note up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that would be a major 7. If we want to go minor, we've got a minor 7 there. And then what you can do is take those notes and just spread them out and voice them in a really thick sort of way. So instead of playing the chord like this, you can play it like this, or like this. So there's a lot of ways to really beef up your chords without playing anything too overly complicated. In this particular jam, we're starting in the key of A flat. So we've got an A flat major 7. So here's an A flat major. We add this G on top. Becomes a major 7. And what's cool is I can keep this same chord on the top and just move the bottom notes. And it becomes another chord, and now it becomes an F minor 7. Which you can also play like this. You can voice it all sorts of different ways. Then we have a G minor 7. And then a C minor 7. Which I'm playing this way, but you could also play this way or this way. So I'm gonna go ahead and record these chords in now. All right, well, that's close enough for now. What I'll do is just a very quick and dirty quantize. I'll hit Command A to select all of these. And go to Edit, Quantize, or just hit Command U. Now, typically for these kinds of sounds, I want to make sure that all of the notes sort of extend all the way until the next ones start, so that it's a really fluid kind of sound, and I'll get rid of that one little flub there. Let's drag these guys out a little bit. Not going for perfection, but something a little bit more in the spirit of future pad. There. So now we're going to learn how to do that nice choppy gated effect that we heard in the beginning. So to do that, I'm going to need my gate audio effect. So we'll go to Audio Effects, Gate, and drag it to the track. So the way we're using a gate in this circumstance, we're actually triggering it with something. So you may have done side chaining before using things like auto filter or the compressor. So likewise, the gate also has a sidechain input, and it's one of those hidden features. So you have to click on the little triangle here to see all the sidechain stuff. And you may have noticed in the very beginning, that there was this track up here labeled Ghost. And this track was just a trigger track for our gate. So we're not actually hearing it, we're only hearing its effect on the gate, hence Ghost track. So Command-Shift-T will give me my new track, and Command-R will rename it to Ghost 2. So our Ghost track needs to have a very fast attack and a very fast release, because this is going to trigger our gate to turn on and off. And our gate, in turn, is going to tell our future pad track to turn on and off. And that's essentially what a gate is. It's just like the gate on your fence. It opens and closes. So when it's open, it lets signal through. When it's closed, it doesn't let any signal through. So now let's create the sound that we're going to trigger our gate with. So for this, I don't need anything fancy. I'm just going to grab an analog, and I'm going to turn off oscillator 2 since I only really need one of them active. I'm going to change this to a square wave, which has a lot of harmonics in it. It's very sort of in-your-face sound. I'm going to go to amp 1, and you can see this is where my envelope is for amp 1, and I'm just going to create a box out of that. A nice square box. So we've got very fast attack, very fast release. So we've got a sound that's like this, essentially. It kind of reminds me of a telegraph sound. And that's sort of how we're using it. We're not really playing notes with it. We're just rhythmically tapping this according to how we want our gate to act. So I'm just going to record a nice ghost pattern using my new Ghost track. So you might have noticed that I let that go for a while. I played it for a long time. It's just because I like to have a bit more rhythmic variation there. Some of those bars I played a little differently. But if you want, you can just record 1 or 2 bars and just loop that section. So now I'm going to go Command-A to highlight everything. And then I'm going to right-click and go down to Quantize Settings. This is always a good idea to do before you quantize anything. And here I can see I've got it set to the wrong setting. So I don't want it set to 8th notes. I've got a very syncopated sort of 16th note rhythm. So I want to set this to 16th note grid. So let's go back to our Future 2 track now. So I want to assign the sidechain input for the gate. So first I need to turn on the sidechain, and then I need to tell it where to get the audio input from. So I'll go to where it says no input and set that to Ghost 2. So now the Ghost 2 track is set to be the sidechain input on my gate. Remember, we had the Future 2 track muted, so we need to reactivate it so we can hear it. So now if we play this, we can still only hear our Ghost 2 track, but we can't hear the Future 2 track. And that's kind of the opposite of what we want. So the reason we can't hear the Future 2 track is because of the way the gate controls are set, particularly the threshold control. So now you can hear the effect of the gate doing its thing once I change the threshold and the return settings, but I can still hear that control track. I can still hear the Ghost 2 track, and I don't want to hear that. So what I'll do is go up to Ghost 2 and just mute it. So now we can hear this gating effect, It's pretty close to what I want. It's still not quite as choppy and quick or staccato as I'd like it to be. So there's a couple of ways I can remedy this. I can either go to my actual Ghost 2 track and change that volume envelope from a big box to more of a quick sort of spike like this. So that was a really effective technique, just changing the envelope in our Ghost track to shorten the notes. But an alternative method would be to go to your MIDI track for your Ghost track and just shorten all of the notes that way. So you can Command A, select all of them, and just grab the nearest one and just shorten their lengths like this. So it's sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It had really the same effect in terms of sound. It's just whatever way you find easier. So lastly, I'm going to add an auto filter just to give some of that nice filter sweep at the beginning of this track. So we'll go back to our Future 2 track now. And we'll add an auto filter at the very end of all of this. So remember, if you click on the filter cutoff frequency, which is what we want to automate, it will automatically show up as the automation parameter on our track. And I'm just going to draw it in the way that I feel it should look. We'll hit play and see what happens here. So that's sounding pretty good, actually. I'd maybe just give it a touch more resonance, just to kind of make the filter a little more juicy. And now we've got a nice little bit of filter automation at the beginning to really liven up the sound. So there we have it, our FuturePad tutorial. I hope you found it useful and enjoy making some awesome future sounds.